Well, let's begin learning about how to identify plants. Before we actually get started in the details of that, however, we need to cover a couple of things. You might call them housekeeping details, and that is safe, legal botanizing. So going out and looking at plants is what botanists call botanizing. First thing, you need to be safe, and that is going to be learning to recognize poison ivy. Do you know whether or not you are sensitive to poison ivy? Do you know how to recognize it or identify it? Well, if not, then before you set foot in a wooded or brushy area in the Appalachian area, and many areas of the United States, you need to be able to avoid contact with this plant. So, there are ways to recognize poison ivy. So as you can see in this illustration, the phrase, "leaves of 3, beware of me," really works because the leaves of poison ivy have 3 leaflets. So it looks like when you look down, you see the leaf, it looks like it's made up of 3 parts. Leaves of 3, beware of me. These leaflets usually have large marginal teeth or notches. Now, in some cases, you may even find that they don't have any large teeth or notches. They have entirely even edges or margins, but generally, poison ivy will have these large teeth or notches, and some things that people call poison oak would each actually have really fairly deep notches, so the leaves look more lobed. The surface is oily or shiny. Remember, it's the oil on the surface of the leaves in the plant that's going to give you the rash. And the leaflets are oval with a pointed tip. So not only do the leaflets have these notched or toothed margins, but they have a long pointed tip to the oval shape. You will often see poison ivy either climbing up trees, and sometimes they can be so robust that when you look up at the tree, what you think are branches of the tree coming off with leaves are actually branches of poison ivy coming off the vine that's climbing up the tree. They can form brush thickets, maybe as high as 6 feet high, that's a couple of meters, or scattered low upright plants on the forest floor, usually one little stem at a time, but quite common on the forest floor. In autumn, look for white berries in grape-like clusters. Well, that's being safe in terms of poison ivy. I also want you to be a good steward and citizen of the area where you are. So that means legal botanizing. If you are in government-protected parks, please do not pick any plants or flowers. Just look at them. If you are in unprotected public areas, then please be considerate of others who are wanting to also enjoy the wildflowers. Limit any picking done just to be able to identify the plant. You don't need the whole plant, just usually a leaf or maybe a flower. And do that picking away from the trails. Go back off the trails and find some plants that are not so obvious from the trail, so that the ones on the trail are still left for others to enjoy. On private property, always ask the owner for permission to enter and to do any collecting. Now, something I should mention is that, first of all, we will be showing you close-ups of plants and flowers to give you a better understanding of the characteristics. Well, these close-ups were taken with plants that were collected only outside of state and national parks or other protected parks. Another thing I want to mention is that from time to time I will be saying that this plant might be a nice addition to a wildflower garden, or how you might be able to transplant the plant. Be aware that when I'm telling you this, I'm not encouraging you just to dig up any plant that you find, but rather you need to be sure that there will be plenty of other plants left where you are collecting. And this is, of course, only if you have permission from the landowner, or say if you're in a road right-of-way, which apparently in Tennessee and in North Carolina, the plants there are not protected. So if you, so what you should do if you want to have things in your wildflower garden is, first of all, check to see if those are available from nursery propagated materials. And it's very easy now to go online, do a search on the plant, and find a nursery that carries that plant, so you don't have to go out and actually dig it up. If you are determined to be, if you are determined for the challenge of being able to try to grow these plants from the wild, then make sure that there are plenty of plants available to maintain the population from which you collect the plants. So you should never collect a plant, or dig up a plant, if there are not at least 20 or more plants left behind to sustain the population. So that if you are wanting to collect, say, 5 or 10 plants, you would want to go in where there are hundreds or thousands of plants growing, so that you know you are not disturbing the actual population of plants and not destroying it. So that is what I want to say in terms of being a good steward of the resources around you and being a good citizen of the area where you live. Now that brings us to looking at 3 essential things that are important for identifying plants. That is classification, habitats, and traits. That is, traits of the plants. All 3 are actually important in identification. So let's look at classification. Here we start out with some circles to represent a couple of things. These small circles, those are individual plants. And it takes many individuals to basically make one species. A species is a set of individuals, and the set has a unique combination of traits that characterize each species, each set. And the individuals in that set, in that species, will have those characteristics. Now, species are given 2 Latin names. We'll talk about the first Latin name in just a moment, but the second word in that Latin name specifically refers to that individual species. And that second name is not capitalized. Okay, so you'll notice now that there is, in classification, a pattern of sets nested within sets, or groups within groups. So we have individuals within a species. Now, we will go from 1 species to, in this illustration, 10 species. We have 5 species that have some indication of blueness that characterize them, different shades of blue. Another set of 5 species that are characterized by some shade of yellow with a red outline. So there are 10 species. So we now then can form 2 sets of species. Each of these sets is called a genus, and the plural is genera. A genus is a group of species that share certain traits, actually share many traits. In fact, they share basically all the traits except the traits that distinguish each of the species. Now, it is the genus name that is the first part of a Latin name of the species. So the genus name is capitalized, and it's like the surname. So in the genus species, the genus is like the surname, the species is like the given name of the species. And finally, we can group genera into families. So here we have in this family 2 genera. A family is a group of similar genera, and so what we find when we look out in nature, we have lots of species sharing a basic set of characteristics. Well, this basic set of characteristics is the characteristics of the family. So it puts all those species into one family, and the species are in, of course, in genera, so that means also those genera are in that one family. This basic set of characteristics makes the family easy to identify and easy to distinguish from other families. Now let's just comment briefly on the concept that it takes all 3 classification, traits, and habitats to be able to really identify species and know what you're looking at. First of all, you need to learn the habitat preferences of each species of a genus. That's because each species often is restricted and has certain habitat preferences, so that by observing the characteristics of the habitat, things like the vegetation, slope, soil, and drainage, and knowing which species prefers that combination, then you can basically quickly narrow down the identification to one or just a few species, and then from there you can just use the characteristics of the traits of the species. Second, learn to recognize whole families by family traits. As I said, there's this general set of traits by which you can recognize these families easily. So if you learn those traits, then that gives you the ability to say, there's a whole bunch of species out there. You can immediately see and say, oh, that belongs to such and such family. So then I don't have to worry about trying to sort it out, this one species from all the other species that are out there. I can narrow it down to just the family. And as we said, there are groups within groups. So species are in genera, genera in families. So you want to be able to also then know the specific traits and the generic traits. So once you have a family, if you know some of the major genera and what those traits are, that's helpful. But certainly you're going to need to look at the species carefully, to look at the differences, the traits that distinguish one species from another. So that is why classification, knowing that internested sets, knowing the traits of those sets and the habitats of the individual species will make it much easier for you to actually be able to recognize what you were looking at.